This is a partnership with American Planning Association Idaho Chapter. So we have two APA Idaho members here. We have Mike Ray, he's the planning manager at the City of Moscow. And then we have Brad Cramer, who is the Community Development Services Director at the City of Idaho Falls. And then I will hand it off to, I believe, Mike.
Thanks, Elizabeth. Well, I'm here tonight to talk about area city impact, and I have a presentation we'll go through, but really, you know, in my experience, area city impact has been one of the most confusing topics that that you end up, you know, running into as far as just people that live in the area city impact, people live in the city or live in the county. And it's kind of good to go through all the requirements and kind of the framework for area city impact. So let me try to share my screen here. Can everybody see that?
Yep.
Okay. I just wanted to start off with just kind of, you know, this is going to be more of a
Mike, I'm going to jump in. We are seeing your notes on the right side, so it's not full screen for us.
Okay.
I think you can change that over up in display settings. Yeah, try that.
Cool. That works.
There we go. Yep, you're good.
Perfect.
Okay. Well, I'm going to provide a lot of background, but I also wanted to make this kind of a case study for the City of Moscow, Latah County area. So just wanted to, you know, make everybody familiar with where Moscow is. So we're up on the Panhandle, North Idaho, right on the state border with Washington. We have Pullman, Washington, which is just 8 miles across the border. Washington State University is in Pullman. Pullman's got a population of about 35,000 people. Moscow has University of Idaho, and with a population of about 25,000 people. And as you can see from the Google Earth image here, we're primarily surrounded by agricultural land. So this is kind of the eastern boundary of what they call the Palouse region, which is a large portion of eastern Washington and northern Idaho. And then we abut some forest lands. This is Moscow Mountain here on the northeast of your screen. And then a closer view of City of Moscow. So you can see the city limits boundary outlined in blue on your screen. Got 2 state highways, US 95, as well as State Highway 8. To the left of your screen here is the road into Pullman. So what is an area city impact? State code really doesn't provide us a whole lot of details on that. There's really no definition within state code. They don't have an intent statement either, but they do require establishment of the area city impact, including the adoption of a comp plan and land use ordinances that are to be applied within that area. And really the authority is derived from Local Land Use Planning Act. I think that previous presenters had gone through LUPA, Chapter 65 of Idaho State Code, and went over kind of the basic tenets of that. And I'll reiterate kind of the purpose statement of LUPA. The purpose of this act shall be to promote the health, safety, and general welfare of the people of the state of Idaho as follows. And then you have kind of these 13 purpose sentences here. And, you know, trying to figure out area city impact, I wanted to highlight a few of those. You know, first one, to protect property rights while making accommodations for other necessary types of development, such as low-cost housing, mobile home parks, ensure that adequate public facilities and services are provided to people at a reasonable cost. So, you know, not push that burden onto the city and the taxpayer. All the developers essentially pay their share along the line. Encourage protection of prime agricultural, forestry, mining lands, and land uses for production of food, fiber, and minerals, as well as the economic benefits they provide to the community. You know, in our area, it's primarily preserving of this prime agricultural land. which is primarily dry land farming within the area. So it doesn't require any type of irrigation, which is a rather unique thing. And then to encourage urban and urban type development within incorporated cities. So this gets to, kind of having that urban development, requiring those areas to annex if it's urban style development, and keeping more agricultural rural development in the county. And then looking at the section that's covered by annexation, there is an intent statement there that we can glean a little bit of information off of. Going through, the policy of the state of Idaho, that cities of the state should be able to annex lands which are reasonably necessary to assure that orderly development of Idaho cities in order to allow efficient and economically viable provision of tax-supported and fee-supported municipal services. To enable the orderly development of private lands which benefit from the cost-effective availability of municipal services in urbanized areas, and to equitably allocate the costs of public services and management of development of the urban fringe. So it's kind of this logical and orderly configuration of property as it's developed surrounding the city. So then it directs us to kind of the geographic area. How do you define what that boundary looks like? And the first one that they consider is trade area. Well, really what is trade area? There's no definition. We just have the word in the statutes. It's generally defined as a geographical area from which customers are drawn, looking at the dictionary definition. So, taking a look at what that means for cities, really it's just where the city is currently providing services or expects to provide services into the future. So, usually in rural areas, in my mind, this can be a lot larger than maybe more urbanized areas, mainly because you have a large portion of the population that is coming in from more rural areas into these cities to use the services. So, somebody from St. Mary's, which is an hour and a half away, may drive all the way down to Moscow in order to go to a retail store, go to Walmart. So the trade area becomes quite a bit larger. We do have emergency services. So if you're just outside the city limits boundary, of course, emergency services are still going to respond. It may be a different fire district, but there is going to be some fire services from the city of Moscow that's going to end up serving the needs of just more residents on the periphery of the city. And then over the years, really the trend of e-commerce has kind of blurred these trade boundaries, especially more recently with a number of people that are starting to work from home because of the COVID pandemic. And so we've seen this a lot with a lot of people migrating from other states into Idaho, resulting in large population growth because of the ability to be able to work from home, as well as growth of Amazon and Walmart and some of these other online retailers. So as a result, we really rely less on the trade area in defining the geographic boundary of the area of city impact. And of course, I had to throw in Moscow's farmers market. We have, talk about trade area. We have people that come from long distances every Saturday during the summer to attend the Moscow farmers market. We have people, vendors from central Washington that drive all the way over. So think about trade area, and it really just varies depending upon what segment it is. For the next one, we have geographical factors. There could be natural or man-made that we've kind of identified. So just taking a look at the city of Moscow, what man-made factors do we have? So looking at the Idaho-Washington boundary, certainly a man-made factor. Of course, we can't grow across the state line. So that really prohibits our growth to the west. We also have two bodies of water. So we've got Paradise Creek that flows through the city. And we also have the South Fork of the Palouse River on the south end of town there. So how do those natural geographical boundaries end up affecting the area city impact boundary? Other man-made boundaries would be potentially University of Idaho. So U of I contains a large portion of the city limits here in the southwest corner. They also own land out in the county and the city. So this would be the dairy operation, the North Farm. And they also have another agricultural operation on the east end of town within a portion of the area city impact. So, you know, these large institutional uses could affect the area city impact boundary as well. This is actually in our comp plan. So we identified all the steep slopes. So it could be terrain. So obviously this is a natural geographical factor here. And then of course, oftentimes we look at property ownership. So this is a parcel map of the area. You can see kind of the large parcel boundaries as you go in the periphery of the city. And oftentimes we won't want to divide a property in half with the area city impact boundary to have that different rules apply to different portions of the property. So oftentimes the line is set on common property lines and it follows those. That's why you end up with more of a zigzag pattern. So just applying our area city impact so you can see how it kind of follows a lot of the property lines here. And then more of a clean version. That brings us to our third consideration. Area is reasonably expected to be annexed to the city in the future. Well, you know, what does that mean? Expected to be annexed in how many years? So typically, you know, maybe comp plans looking 20, 30 years out. Do we look at that time frame? Hard to plan beyond 10 years most of the time. So, you know, we probably look at, 10, 20 years as the maximum time for looking at the area that's potentially going to be annexed in the future. You can also look at things like population growth. I mean, we've had really steady kind of linear population growth over the years. We're just at 1% annually. So certainly not growing in leaps and bounds. We've always just been fairly steady. So you can certainly extrapolate that over the years and figure out kind of an area that could potentially likely be annexed into the future. And then we have historical data that we also take a look at. This is city limits boundary dating all the way back from 1891. You can see that, the city hasn't grown that much, but I mean, you're looking at 100 years from 1891 all the way up to 2005 here. So that kind of gives you an indication. Also gives you an indication as to what parts of the city were growing. And you can look at those trends and it'll give you a better indication as to where the area city impact boundary could lie. Going back to state code, comprehensive plans and ordinances within the area city impact can be either the county's plan and ordinances, city's plan and ordinances, or other plan and ordinances. So it really gives you some options there, but you need to have some type of comp plan and ordinances in place to coincide with state code. So I just wanted to go through a brief history of kind of Moscow, Latah County area city impact history. Shortly after the Local Land Use Planning Act, area city impact initially appeared via 1979 ordinance, but it wasn't really mutually adopted between the city and the county. The first one that was mutually adopted was in 1993. And then came along a Supreme Court case, the state of Idaho, the 2000 case of Latah versus Eagle City Council. And that determined that the cities cannot have extraterritorial authority. It's just advisory. So you can't be pretty much running the county, or cities can't have the authority within the county, essentially is what that said. So we had that situation going on. Our 1993 agreement pretty much said the city had the authority of administering the area city impact, and the county really wasn't involved a whole lot. And so we ended up, the county ended up being sued in 2003 by Utzman which resulted in our area city impact agreement being deemed unconstitutional by a district court. And so at the time, really put us in an interim agreement while we renegotiated an area city impact agreement, which ended up being adopted in 2006. And these were kind of examples of the boundaries at the time. So the 1993 boundary is more of that teal color on the outskirts, and then the 2004-2006 boundary is more of the magenta color there. And then we've got the city limits boundary here in the red and white dashed line. And, you know, I thought that this was a good image to indicate the likelihood of areas being annexed into the future. So you're looking at the current city limits boundary at the time, and you're looking at the teal colored boundary that existed in 1993, and reasonably expecting in 10 years, we're pretty much going to double in size to that area. Probably not. So, you know, it was reduced in 2004, 2006. And I think that that's a more accurate representation of where we're, you know, the growth that's happening in Moscow and the likelihood that we're going to annex all the properties within the area city impact. So just points back to one of those aspects of determining the boundary. And then, yeah, getting back to this image over the last 100 years, you know, how much we've grown, and then expecting that we're going to double within 10, 20 years, probably not likely. Governing boards are required to review area city impacts. So that's every 10 years to determine whether negotiations in the best interest of their citizenry. Really just requires a review, not necessarily anything to happen. So, you know, that's an area that state code could possibly be improved. Those mutually agreed negotiations could follow any process and time frame as may be mutually agreeable between the two parties. And then that brings us to our 2019 agreement. So this is our most recent agreement with Latah County. In 2015, we ended up holding a joint meeting to discuss renegotiations. It was decided to wait until we had.
Offside down there.
What's that?
She's running offside.
Yeah, I know.
The defense is so far up.
Yeah.
It doesn't even.
You guys hear that? So it was decided to wait until the city zoning code and comprehensive plan updates were completed. So over the last few years, we've been working on updating those, and it was useless to enter into renegotiations when those plans were going to be updated shortly. So in 2018, we began jointly drafting the amendment to the area city impact agreement in the fall after we ended up adopting the zoning code and comp plan amendments. And then in February 20th of 2019, we had an updated ACI agreement that was executed. And this is, I'm not going to go into this in a whole lot of detail, but this is generally what we have in our agreement. We've got the area, so the definition of the boundary. We've got some definitions that pertain to the agreement, what plans and ordinances are governing within the area city impact, who administers what the appeal process looks like, enforcement, so there are complaints in the area city impact. You deal with that in that section, conflict with other ordinances, which takes precedent, and then what the process is for renegotiation of the agreement. So looking at our adopted plans and ordinances, we have the city's comp plan and the future land use map. And I think that this is, you know, really important to kind of have the city's comp plan to be able to plan as the city grows and annexes property in the future. We also have the subdivision and manufactured home and RV park ordinances, but we did make some modifications. So we adopted the county's nonconformity section, the flood hazard areas. So the floodplain in the county is actually more restrictive. We wanted that to apply within the area city impact. Plan unit developments are really a city thing. You know, if people are pursuing plan unit developments in the area city impact, they really need to be directed to annex into the city. And so we just eliminated that option within the area city impact to direct people to annex and go through that process if they wish to pursue a PUD. City's urban agriculture. So we have kind of a wide urban agricultural ordinance that's a lot more in depth than the counties, and wanted to give people those opportunities that they have in the city to do more market gardens and community gardens within the area city impact. And then really the crux of this is the ag forest zone, which I think 88% of the area city impact between Latah County is designated as ag forest right now. And I'm showing this much detail because I wanted to give you an idea of the kind of adjustments that you can make in your own agreement to really just craft it towards your own circumstance. So deletion of salvage, wrecking, and junkyards per conditional use. So we actually went in the zone and eliminated that. Certainly in the middle of the county in an ag forest zone, that may be an appropriate use, but up against the city, certainly not looked upon very fondly by residents that are next to a full-blown salvage wrecking operation. So we did eliminate that. And then some animal husbandry uses. Certainly we're an agricultural area and you do have farm operations, albeit not really large scale farm operations with any animal husbandry, but you do get that. And having a number of animals, so say 250, what they currently allow up against the city limits, also would have, come along with those nuisance issues. So I wanted to still permit that to a certain extent, but reduce it to 50. And then looking at the county's ag forest zone. So a number of years ago, the city ended up reducing their lot size for the ag forest zone from 40 acres to 10 acres. And here or there, we didn't necessarily agree with that being next to the city and reducing that to the 10-acre minimum. We wanted to keep it at the 40-acre minimum lot size to encourage people to annex into the city and eliminate kind of this fragmentation of the area city impact that would in turn make it harder to be able for the city to be able to grow and logically develop. So we ended up keeping the city's current 40-acre parcel size and then inserting language. Actually, the county had in their ordinance that the small parcel and remnant parcel should have a designated building site that's no larger than 2 acres where all residential structures can be placed. The building site and all structures shall be placed in a manner to preserve productive farmland, streams, riparian areas, and other unique natural features, allow for the logical extension of existing and planned roadways, to ensure that natural resources are protected and the city of Moscow can grow in an efficient and logical manner. And I think that, it sums it up fairly well as to, kind of the intent of those properties within the area city impact. So this brings up our kind of a zoning map within that area. I mentioned previously, a large portion of the lands there are zoned ag forests. So we've had a few rezones, so it's probably a little less now, but previously it was 88% zoned ag forest. And we use this sort of more of a, kind of an agricultural growth boundary to limit the growth of the city and try to shift the growth into annexations in the city and limit the number of subdivisions that we have within the area city impact. Looking at the agreement, we lay out administration. So, one thing I'd like to point out is that we get to enjoy a really good working relationship with Latah County. I think that that's what's made our kind of case study so successful, is that, we get along great and we're usually on the same page. And it always is helpful to have conversations when, somebody's looking at doing a land use action within the area city impact, to be able to call the county and discuss that with them instead of having the applicant talk to the city and talk to the county, and the county and the city not being on the same page. And so that's really been helpful over the years to get the product that you're looking for as far as development in the area city impact. But administration, we work together on those permits and inquiries and requests in the ACI. we have it laid out where the county receives all the documentation, plans, and then forwards it down to the city. And then the city ends up forwarding a recommendation back to Latah County. We have to do that within 15 days of the receipt. And then quasi-judicial applications, we conduct one public hearing and then forward the recommendation onto the county. And they have the option of accepting, rejecting, or modifying the city's recommendation. So it could be anywhere from administrative permits, so house additions within the area city impact of pre-existing homes. We'd review it for setback requirements, building height, things of that nature, and then send a recommendation back to the county, and the county would make the final decision. And this is another zoning map of the area city impact. And then so part of this, we would look at what the zoning of that area is, and that kind of determines what your setbacks, what your building height, lot size, lot width, things like that within those areas. And I think Aaron Qualls at the last session had talked a little bit about the future land use map and the zoning map, and how those two are different but related. And that's how our zoning map and the area city impact relates to development that happens. And we also have the future land use map, which has been, like I previously mentioned, which has been adopted within the area city impact. And so that's what this looks like. And this really guides development within the city, as well as the area city impact and beyond when we look at proposals. And then another large aspect of area city impact and the city in general is just the thoroughfare plan. So this shows up in our comprehensive plan. This is all the future and current roadway alignments, as well as existing designations. So it could be a local street, could be a collector street, could be an arterial, and it lays out all those future extensions. So when we do get proposals in the area city impact, we're able to react to those and look at these plans and determine what needs to be done to enable the city to grow in more of that logical, orderly fashion. So I wanted to kind of highlight an area here. This is on the east side of town. And I think for the most part, the city's done a fairly good job of trying to contain kind of the urban, what you call it, suburban residential growth in the city limits, and leaving agricultural land on the outskirts at the time then they're planning on developing would be annexed into the city. And so this kind of gives an example of that. We look at, so say somebody wants to do a subdivision area city impact, we would look at the comprehensive plan land use designation. In this circumstance, it would be auto urban residential, points us to the comp plan narrative. It's really a kind of a low to moderate density. So similar development that's already occurred in that area, 7,000, 11,000 square foot lots. And then it points us to appropriate zoning designation. So R1, R2, or R3, and then directs us to include a mix of single family, twin home, townhouse, residential dwellings within that area. And so that's really how it's applied when we look at potential annexations or development within the area city impact. We also have areas that as the city grows, you end up going into areas that were in the county previously, or I guess this would still be in the county, but maybe hadn't enacted the city's plans, and there was some type of fragmentation that has occurred over the years. And this is really what we're not going for. It's just this low, extremely low rural density that really prevents the city from growing in a logical and orderly fashion. And this is one of those areas that we've almost just written off, because you look at the parcel configuration in this area, and it's hard to visualize any type of urban type subdivision development in this area, much less trying to get some of our infrastructure as far as roadways through this area. What you end up happening is, potentially pushing that burden onto the taxpayer in the city to try to extend services up to properties maybe beyond that, which are more whole and can be developed at more of a urban density. And so that's one of our areas that we struggle with over the years. looking at that area, we designated as suburban residential because, there's really not a whole lot of opportunities for further densification in the city within that area. And then I'll end it with kind of an example in the northwest quadrant of the city. And this is something we're starting to see more and more and struggle with are these smaller scale subdivision developments out in the county. This happens to be on the border. So somebody requests like 4-lot subdivision up in this area up here. So right up against the area city impact boundary. City limits boundary is this blue line here. Our issue in this area is that we really can't serve it with utilities. There's topographical factors here. You can't get services up over hills without booster lift stations, at a substantial cost and burden to the city. And we're starting to see more and more of these kind of rural requests for smaller subdivisions that maybe meet the comp plan designation for the area city impact, but we just can't serve and, still end up being approved just because they meet all the requirements of the code. And this is kind of an example. So rural and agriculture designation up here still points to ag forest or farm ranch as appropriate zones. Farm ranch is 3 acres. So they come in with a subdivision plat that includes 4 lots, that are no less than 3 acres in size. In these circumstances, we're looking at road improvements, we're looking at transportation, and looking at the thoroughfare plan, you can see there's a proposed minor arterial road that ends up going through this area. These roads are designated as collectors and minor arterials, but they're certainly not developed to that standard. So over these proposals, really what we're looking for is, allowing some minimal development, but making sure that all of our infrastructure can be still put in place whenever the city grows to that area. Maybe it's 20 years, maybe it's 30 years, maybe it's never. And so, we've been shifting to development agreements to require the right-of-way to be dedicated for the minor arterial that goes through the property, and additional right-of-way dedication to get a width of roadway that's wide enough to pretty much accept the standard that they'll be a collector or minor arterial in the future, as well as some right-of-way improvements, roadway improvements on the would be the east side of the road. And so that's where we've been struggling with as far as some area city impact applications, and they're mainly just on that very far periphery, not necessarily up against the city. If they're close to the city, then we typically require those to be, or recommend for those to be annexed into the city. That pretty much concludes, but I did want to plug Idaho Smart Growth with the Area City Impact Toolkit that they collaborated with the University of Idaho in 2012 to put out. This is a great resource for us as planners or local municipalities or citizens just trying to find out more about the process, and some of the convoluted language in the state code does a good job of going through that and trying to discern exactly what the intent of area city impact as well as annexations. So hopefully I didn't go too long or bore you too much, but that would conclude my presentation.
Thanks for that plug. I love it. I guess, Brad, you're up next. Go for it.
Okay. Thank you to Mike for that presentation. Area of impact is a complicated issue, as he mentioned, and really plays into the annexation discussion that I've been asked to cover. So let me make sure I'm sharing the right information here. If you give me just a moment. And hopefully you're not seeing my notes page.
That looks great.
Okay, perfect. Well, and again, thank you to Mike and thank you to Idaho Smart Growth for putting this program on. This is, in my mind, really an important educational opportunity, and certainly appreciate you investing time as viewers of the program. And hopefully it's worth your while as we talk about some really complicated issues in a short amount of time. So I'm going to talk about how cities grow through annexation. And you heard a lot of the principles in Mike's presentation that I'll talk about as well, but apply them in the context of the annexation process. Now, I do want to point out, I have some topics to cover here, but I've designed this so that the first 3 topics are going to be really basic and designed for truly a citizen planning academy. So I know we have some professional planners on the line watching or that have signed up, and this might seem a little bit basic, so I hope you'll bear with me as we cover some of those basics. Although as we get to the last topic there, the 3 categories of annexation, that one's a little bit more of a deep dive, and I think it needs to be, partly because it is a little bit complicated, and it's also something that if you follow the Idaho legislature, it's a topic of conversation that's been on their radar for a little while, not this year, fortunately, but you'll hear them talk about the 3 categories of annexation, and it is complex, but it doesn't have to be. I think we can break it down into an understandable topic. So I'll cover what annexation is, Idaho's annexation law, and then some of the basics of the purposes and requirements of annexation, and then those 3 categories. So let's just talk about what annexation is. And I'm going to use the map on the right. Those properties that you see in the yellow and the teal, those are areas that are already annexed into Idaho Falls. And that hatched area that you see is a property that was recently proposed for annexation. And so when we think about what annexation is at a really basic level, it's about expansion. First of all, it's the expansion of a city's boundaries. It's just literally the city getting larger, more land that will be part of that jurisdiction. It's also an expansion of a city's laws and authority. Now, you heard in Mike's presentation that a city doesn't have any authority outside of its boundaries. So once it annexes land, the landowners there as part of the city now become subject to all of the city's laws, its taxation, and anything that the city does in terms of governance and its local codes and ordinances. And then finally, it's an expansion of a city's services. And we'll talk a lot about services as a concept, and it's important to keep in mind that services means both tax-supported and fee-supported services. So again, as you heard in Mike's final example there, even though land might be annexable in terms of it's close to the city and can be annexed, sometimes a city can't provide those services. And so it has to ask those questions when it asks whether or not it wants to annex a property. So Idaho's annexation law is covered in Title 50, so 50-222, and it defines a few things. First of all, it talks about the purpose of annexation, and we'll cover those. It talks about the 3 categories of annexation, A, B, and C, and then it gives the legal procedures for each category. And there are some universal things that carry over from A, B, and C, and there are some slight differences depending on which process, which category you're in. We'll try to outline what those slight differences are. So let's talk about the purpose of annexation. And I'm not gonna read all of this, but this is directly from the statute. So the authority to annex actually lies with the state, but it delegates that authority to cities to be able to annex property into its boundaries. And it gives its reasons for annexation to assure the orderly development of Idaho cities. And you'll see orderly, the word orderly pop up a number of times. So orderly development of Idaho cities in order to allow efficient and economically viable provision of tax-supported and fee-supported municipal services, and to enable the orderly development, see there's that word again, of private lands which benefit from those services, and to equitably allocate the costs of those public services in management of development of the urban fringe. So you see some themes and some repeated concepts of orderly development, and the efficient and economically viable provision of services, both tax supported and fee supported. And these are all very important concepts to keep in mind, especially when we get into the category discussion, A, B, and C. So let's talk about that purpose. When we think about orderly development, if you can imagine with me for just a second that gray box that you see on the screen is a city, and it's perfectly square. Wouldn't that be nice? And everything in the green is in unincorporated county land that's not been annexed. When you think about that purpose of annexation, and you think about maybe parcels like these 3 boxes that are a long ways away from a city. This is not orderly development. The statute recognizes that if cities start to grow in this checkerboard fashion, in a way that's not orderly and efficient, that it causes problems and raises the overall cost of managing that city. It also causes problems for counties. And so really what the statute is doing is saying, no, you need to grow in an orderly manner, slowly, and from that box that we show in that perfect world, slowly expanding outward in a way that makes sense, so that as other parcels come in, it makes sense, and the county and the city can anticipate where growth will happen in that orderly fashion. We'll come back to that map a couple of times. I want to spend just a couple of minutes again talking about the difference between tax-supported and fee-supported services, because when we get into these hearings about annexations and we say the word services, I think what I've recognized most people do is they think about the utilities, the fee-supported services. But there's also a series of tax-supported services that cities have to be able to efficiently provide and provide in an economically feasible way. So those includes things like public safety, your fire departments, your police departments. It might include parks, recreation, street maintenance, and your planning and zoning services, very essential services. Those are all tax-supported from our property taxes for the most part. And everybody pays their share towards those services. You also have fee-supported services. So again, a purpose of annexation is to provide these in an efficient and cost-effective way. So these are primarily utilities: water, sewer, garbage, power, maybe a fiber in your town. These are the things that we tend to think about in terms of city services, but these are really the fee-supported, that your ratepayers are paying for these, not your property taxes. And it is an important distinction to keep in mind. So now we come back to this map that we had originally with the city in the center, and then looking at those three boxes on the outskirts. When you think about providing those services, it is not really an efficient and cost-effective thing to do to run sewer lines and water lines 3 miles out of town to provide random services to parcels on the way outward fringe of the city when it's really not close to that city core. But even outside of those fee-supported services, tax-supported services are also expensive to provide if you're not doing growth in an orderly way. So to send a city policeman or a city fireman 3 or 4 or 5 miles outside of town is really not very efficient. We want to have those services close to where we already have existing services. So again, we think about growth in condensed and compact methods so that we have that orderly growth that we talked about earlier, because it is more cost effective and it is more efficient. Now, I also want to point out that this principle works in reverse when it comes to the county. So what I'm showing you on this map were parcels that were way outside of a city's boundary. That's really inefficient to provide services way outside of a city's boundary. It's also inefficient to leave county islands in the middle of a city. And we'll talk about that in the categories, because one of the things that I think is important to understand is why the state has different categories of annexations, why it allows the cities to have certain types of annexation that don't require consent of the landowner. That's one of the things that we hear about in the news and the legislature, is that Idaho is one of the few states that allows annexation to happen in that way. But it's actually a very important tool for cities and for counties. So let's talk about universal requirements. And you're going to see this map a lot because it shows actually a lot of different principles of annexation. So the first one is contiguity. And when we talk about contiguity, we're talking about property that physically touches the existing city boundary. In order to be annexed, whether it's category A, B, or C, the property has to be contiguous with the existing city limits. Now, the statute itself actually uses the word adjacent as well. I think most cities use that as contiguous and adjacent as really the same word. And there are some exceptions here, and I'm not going to go into all of them. The statute does have some odd things in it, but contiguity also has to be achieved in an orderly manner. And what I mean by that is the statute specifically talks about certain types of contiguity that don't count. So let's take this parcel that I just put on the bottom of the map there. It's yellow and red, outlined in red there. If that property wanted to develop and it needed sewer and water and therefore needed to be part of the city, as you look at that, it's clearly not touching any part of the existing city. And so it has to figure out how to become contiguous. The statute prohibits contiguity through what they call a shoestring. And what they're talking about is when you have a city can't just annex a road or a railroad or just some small strip of land to make a property contiguous. That's not orderly development. And the court cases that are out there are really extreme examples. So you're talking about 3 or 5 mile strips of land where cities attempted to annex 5 miles of road to get a parcel of land contiguous. And the courts have said, that's not orderly growth. That's not reasonably necessary for your city to grow. So this kind of annexation doesn't work. You can't just annex a road to become contiguous. So one of the things that happens commonly, at least around the Idaho Falls area, and I'm sure elsewhere in the state, is a parcel more like what you see there on Countryside Lane, where a county home that was on septic has had the septic fail, and maybe it wants to be on city sewer so it doesn't have to deal with septic anymore. Well, again, it's under the same requirement that if they want that sewer, they can't just annex a road to get themselves contiguous. Now, does that mean a city can't provide sewer service out there? No, the city can still do that. And there are some tools such as annexation agreements or development agreements where that property owner can agree to be annexed later and still receive sewer. That's still okay if the city wants to do that. Now, as a professional planner, I'd recommend the city doesn't do that because there's, first of all, no saying when it will become contiguous and whether or not when it happens, the owner who is there at that time was the same owner who signed the agreement. Idaho Falls found itself in a situation with 300 properties that had city utilities in the county, and most of them were different people than had originally signed an agreement. So again, this kind of annexation doesn't work. The property has to be contiguous in a reasonable and orderly way, not just by a shoestring strip of land of right-of-way. So the second universal annexation requirement is that annexed lands have to be part of a city's comprehensive plan. So what you see here on the right is Idaho Falls comprehensive plan, which is typically quite a bit larger than a city's physical boundaries. So for a property to be annexed, it has to show up on this map. So we recently actually had a request for annexation here on the right-hand side. I'm pointing, and obviously you can't see me pointing, but it was in the white area, which is not part of our comprehensive plan. And we had to say, well, listen, either we can't annex you or we have to go through a process to amend our plan to include you. So this, again, keeps coming back to the idea of orderly growth, that cities really have to think about where they can and wish to grow in order to annex land. So it has to be part of that plan. The third requirement that's universal is that after annexation, immediately after annexation, a city has to assign a zone. So there are ordinances passed at the end of a proceeding, and we'll talk about those, where the city assigns a zone. Now, usually the applicant or the developer is requesting a particular zone, and the city's job through the annexation process is to look at its comprehensive plan and look at the existing zoning in the area and look at the parcel of land, what's happening around it, and make sure that that zone makes sense. And I don't know how many of these have covered comprehensive planning. I'm not going to go into it in depth here, but it is a part of assigning that zone, which is a part of annexation. So that's the third thing that has to happen in all annexations. So let's talk a little bit about the categories and procedures that are required for each one. So I've mentioned that there's categories A, B, and C. And with A and B, there are really two types, and there's actually three, but I'm not going to talk about the third because they're fairly rare and probably aren't relevant for this kind of a discussion. The first type of category A is what we call owner initiated. And what we mean by that is that the landowner themselves applies to be part of the city. They apply for annexation, which in the statute, the terms of statute means that they have consented to being annexed. So they want to be part of the city. Pretty simple and straightforward. So you're really, in this case, you're just looking to make sure their property is contiguous, the city can serve it, and it makes sense for the city to annex it. If it does, the city holds a couple of hearings, assuming they have a planning and zoning commission and a city council. And in this case, they don't have to mail a notice. It's a legislative hearing. And so the requirements for that hearing are not as stringent as they would be for something like a rezone or a conditional use permit. They don't have to do the advertising in the newspaper. but they do still have to hold the hearings. And then the city council passes 2 ordinances, or maybe one that does both things, but an ordinance has to annex the land, and then an ordinance also has to assign the zone. And then the last thing the city does is they have to adopt a statement explaining their decision. Now some cities might call that a findings of fact and conclusions of law. They might call it in Idaho Falls, we call it a reasoned statement of relevant criteria and standards, which is a mouthful, but it's really just outlining how the city came to its decision and why. It outlines those facts. Now that's an important document because if you're a resident that didn't like the decision or a developer that didn't like the decision, that's the document that you use in your appeal process. So if you want to file a reconsideration of that decision or an appeal of that decision, you're looking at that statement to see how the city came to its decision to make sure that it followed its own plan, it followed the law, etc. And so you'll see that these ordinances and that statement are a part of all of these proceedings, no matter which category you're in. So the second type of category A really has to deal with city-initiated annexations. And so if you'll see these 2 red boxes that just popped up on the screen around these couple of neighborhoods. Type 2 of category A is really about residential enclaves. And what the statute talks about is enclaves of less than 100 residential parcels. And there's a couple of words in there that are really important to remember. The first is enclave. So an enclave is when land is surrounded by the city. So you can see in these 2 examples that the land is surrounded by existing city limits. That's an enclave. And there's less than 100 residential parcels. Residential is the other key word when it comes to category A. Those parcels have to have a residential land use on them. They can't be commercial, they can't be an office, they have to be residential in order to qualify as a category A annexation. Now, interestingly, consent is not required in these types of annexations. The city does not have to wait for these residents to come to them and request annexation. And I think that's important to know and why. And we'll talk a little bit more about it in depth later with some examples. But really what I think the statute is saying is that these parcels, when they become surrounded by a city, they are so functionally and practically part of a city that the city is authorized to bring them in. And again, we'll talk about that more in depth. The rest of the process is the same. 2 hearings, no mailing, pass the ordinance to annex, when to zone, and adopt your statement. Category B is different, and it has a slightly different procedure to it. And again, there's 2 types. So again, you've seen a couple of more red boxes pop up here. We'll use both of those as examples. Type 1 is, again, you're dealing with less than 100 parcels, just like in that second type of category A, but in this case, they don't have to be residential. They can be really any land use, except for a couple that we'll talk about in just a moment. Now, there also has to be certain things happening on that land. The land has to have been subdivided into parcels of 5 acres or less, or it's being sold in parcels of 5 acres or less, or it's surrounded by the city again. Now, that subdivision or selling of parcels really comes back to the idea that this land is being developed or is ready to be developed. And if it's in that area of impact, then as Mike was talking about, it ought to be in the city. The city has the services to service it, and everything happening around that is in a city. And so the state authorizes the city to consider annexing those lands. Now, there's a new addition to the law that was made, I believe 2 years ago, it may have been 3. But if there's land still on there that is 5 acres or greater, it can't be used for agriculture or forestry if it's going to be considered for annexation as a category B. So the parcel on the top of that picture, that's completely surrounded by the city, but it's all ag. And even though it's been divided into some parcels of 5 acres of less, and there's a couple of homes on it, that land is not eligible for annexation because it has that ag or forestry use on it. Now, again, in this particular type of category B, consent is not required. The statute simply says it's less than 100 parcels where not all owners have consented to annexation. Now, the one difference in category B from category A is that category B properties, annexations have to be within the area of city impact. Category A does not. Category A can go beyond an area of impact. Category B and C have to be within an area of city impact boundary. So that boundary is very important when a city is thinking about lands that may be annexed in the future, especially category B. Now, the city also must pass an annexation plan for that area that they're considering annexing. And that annexation plan has to talk about things like, how is the city going to provide services, both tax supported and fee supported? Excuse me. How are the taxes going to change? What's the effect on other government agencies? So the city has to think about what those things will mean for these property owners and then provide them with that plan. So as it holds its hearings, again, we have our next difference between category A and category B. So with category B, the city still has to hold its hearings, but now it has to provide the property owners within 300 feet notice. It has to publish in the newspaper, and it has to do that notice earlier than it would for other types of hearings. So the notice has to be 28 days in advance, and they're providing the plan, they're providing the notice of what's happening, what zones the city is proposing, all of those things, so that residents that are being affected have a chance to consider it, ask their questions, and learn all they need to know about the proposed annexation. Now, beyond those things, the rest of the process is the same. Pass 2 ordinances, annex it, zone it, adopt a statement explaining the decision. Now, type 2 is a little bit different. So category B, the type 2, is more than 100 parcels and they don't have to be residential. And I've outlined this in the lower left. Now, I know this probably isn't 100 parcels, but pretend that it is. And let's just say that those are, yeah, like 100 parcels or more. Now, these concepts of 5 acres or less and forestry and ag, those all still apply, just like they did for type 1. The difference here is that for a category B annexation to take place, more than 50% of the owners in this area, and measured by land, not by number of owners, are required to consent to annexation. And that can be done in a couple of ways. But in most cases, what we're talking about is implied consent. So if you remember in category A, what we were talking about is an owner coming forward with a written application saying, I want to be part of the city. Often that doesn't happen with category B. But what the state statute means by implied consent is that the owners of that property are receiving a city service and typically a fee supported service. So sewer or water, those are the 2 specifically identified by the statute. So if you can see in that lower left-hand slide, I've outlined some sections in green. So for the sake of this example, if we assumed that those parcels in green were receiving, let's just say sewer, the state says they have consented to be part of the city. They have consented to annexation. And so the city can proceed with this category B if more than 50% of those landowners have consented, whether explicitly or implicitly through the receipt of a city service. The rest of it is the same. Area of impact, annexation plan, 2 hearings, ordinances, statements. So everything there is the same. This one's fairly common with cities that have extended their utilities outside of their city boundaries. So Idaho Falls is one of those cities. City of Boise has dealt with category B, certainly. And I know some other cities around the state as well. Now, category C, I'm not going to spend a lot of time on because it's so difficult to pass one. I don't actually know of a city that's done it. I would certainly never attempt one. I shouldn't say never, but it'd be really unlikely to attempt one. So let's take that same area that we were just talking about in red in the lower left-hand map there. But instead of saying 50% of those owners have consented, look at the green area now. Let's assume it's very small. Okay, so in category C, you're still dealing with more than 100 parcels. And you're still dealing with all the rules around 5 acres and ag and forestry. All those things are the same. But now we're talking about where less than 50% of the owners have consented in any way. In those situations, a city can still attempt an annexation. And they go through the same process. They still have to be in the area of impact. They have to have that plan. They have to hold the hearings. But at the end of the process, they have to poll all of the owners. And if less than 50% of the owners consent, the city cannot proceed with the annexation. So there are some protections for all these property owners that don't want to be a part of the city at this time. If it's just not time or logical to bring them in. What the statute is saying here is that this little group that has the city service really shouldn't make the rest of these eligible at this time. If you're talking about more than 100 parcels that have not consented. Cities really don't attempt category C annexations because at the end of the day, if you don't have 50% of the owners that are consenting, you've probably wasted a lot of time and effort and really frustrated a lot of people when you really won't be able to proceed with that annexation. So I do want to spend just a couple of minutes talking about why category B and C, because it might seem odd, especially in the West and in areas where we really are serious about property rights. Why would the state allow category B and C annexations to even take place? Well, I like to do that by playing a little game called Find the County Island. And I know we don't have a great way to interact, but I just want you to look at this map and think to yourself, where's the county island in this scenario? I mean, you can see the hospital there to the right, you can see some parks, you can see some vacant land and some houses. Where's the county island? Well, the answer is here, right in the center, a residential neighborhood. And in this case, they were receiving both sewer and water, but they had never been annexed. So let's take another example. Find the county island on this map. And there might be some obvious choices, and you may have guessed over here on the right, and you would be correct. This is one of the county islands, but it's not the only one in this picture. It's also this neighborhood. But it really doesn't stand out in any logical way from the neighborhoods around it. It has curb, gutter, and sidewalks, streets, houses that are the same size. How is that not a city development? Well, it was developed in the county and received city water and sewer. And then this is probably my favorite one, and we'll spend a little bit of extra time right here. So where are the county islands here? And again, there's probably an obvious choice there on the right-hand side, and yep, that's a county island. But you probably wouldn't think that this parcel and these, oh, whoops, I went too far. These other two parcels are county islands. Now, again, these were all receiving city services. These have all been annexed, by the way. Every property we've shown in here has since been annexed through a category B process or A. But this slide to me emphasizes the need to have category B and C in the toolbox, especially category B in a city's toolbox. Because if we think back to that original purpose of annexation for orderly growth, cost-effective and efficient provision of services. And remember when I talked about those boxes on the outside of the map, the city map, and that I said the principle worked in reverse. I want you to think about a couple of things. As you think about these city residents on this map, they're all receiving the same water, the same sewer as their neighbors. They're probably receiving the same garbage services, but they have the city police force, they have the city fire department, and they have the city street plows come up and down their roads to keep them clean. And yet they pay a very different tax rate than their next door neighbors who are receiving those same services. Not only that, but now think about it from the county perspective, that the city police force is all in this neighborhood, but yet because these four parcels are in the county, now we have the sheriff's department having to come into the center of the city to service these properties. And add on to that, when we talk about, remember that last purpose in the statute was equitable distribution of costs of those services. All of these city taxpayers are already paying for the city police force and the city fire department, but they're also still county taxpayers. They are still paying for the sheriff. They're still paying for all the county services to come out to these properties. So that's not cost effective. It's not efficient, and it's not an equitable allocation of costs. And so, yes, these homeowners were not happy to be annexed, but the reality is they were a part of the city. They were receiving every benefit that the city had to offer, but they were paying a very different rate for it. And so I'm not asking you to agree with those arguments. I'm just explaining the arguments that I think were used in developing that statute to allow the category A, B, and C. Is there are inequities that that exist when we have county islands within the center of cities. So I come back to this purpose of annexation. Category A and B really allow orderly development, not only on the urban fringe, on the outside of the city, but also on the internal part of the city where we have county islands. It allows the efficient and economically viable provision of those services, both on the fringe and within the center of cities. And it equitably allocates the cost of those services, both on the fringe and within the center of cities. So I am an advocate to keep all three of those tools, or at least the A and the B. Again, category C is not super effective and doesn't get used, but they are important tools for cities to be able to use to equitably allocate those costs. So hopefully that's a understandable enough overview of the annexation statute and the processes. And with that, I'll turn it back over to Sarah and Elizabeth.
That was awesome. Thanks, Brad. Let me see if I can get my own view back to full gallery mode. Okay. So much information. So does anyone have any questions that came up on either topic? I want to throw that out first, and I'm sort of mumbling along for a minute to give people the opportunity to get themselves ready to ask a question if they have one. And if they don't, then I'm happy to jump in with my own questions. Let's see. Oh, it looks like Deanna, go for it.
Thank you both for really great, thorough, but understandable explanations of complex planning concerns that we deal with here in Idaho. I wanted to talk to you. I was really delighted that we had the two of you because you come from, you're located in very different places. And I know that the getting along that you talked about, Michael, up in Moscow and with Latah County hasn't always been true over in Eastern Idaho, and frankly isn't always true in many places. I don't know if Lee's still on here, but I just wondered if the two of you, both when it comes to annexation and the area of impact, you know, how cities, how counties can deal with when they don't agree, when they aren't getting along, and how much that impacts how well we're able to do that intelligent growth pattern that you both so well described. Either one of you or both of you can respond.
I guess I could jump in. Yeah, I mean, I think it'd be extremely detrimental if you didn't get along with the county. I mean, we're fortunate to have a great relationship, and I think part of that over the years has just been being involved in APA Idaho and going to sessions and being on the board. And I think that really that networking, you know, really builds those relationships over time. But really, you know, we do have things that we don't agree all the time on, and a large portion of that is public improvements. And so, you know, as we know, the way cities grow is that the developer pretty much foots the bill for a lot of the infrastructure expenses and improvements. And I mean, we really have that mindset that if you do a subdivision, the developer's responsible for all the infrastructure that gets put in. And it's not necessarily that way out in the county. They see potentially the subdivision that I was talking about before, a quarter mile from the city, and don't really see why the widening of the roadway and curbing and sidewalks should be required on that portion, just because it's, you know, where's it going? It's pretty much going to nowhere. And but we view it as just one segment of the total, you know, the total of a roadway, and everything happens incrementally over time. And if we don't have the individual property owners contribute to that roadway system, then we end up with all this infrastructure that we have to somehow come up with a way to fund and pass that on to maybe somebody else that's a property and taxpayer on the other side of town. So that's one thing we do struggle with, but for the most part, all the other, you know, requirements, we have a lot of conversations and talk about those quite a bit prior to getting to a public hearing or a development. So I think that communication has been probably the best thing that we do.
And I might add as well that as you mentioned, Deanna, we're probably an example of a city and county that don't get along great in terms of the area of impact, although, you know, we're probably further along than we used to be. The detriment that I see to growth, if the city and the county don't agree, is that it can kind of become this arms race. That if the county wants to have growth happen in the county and development happen in the county, and the city also wants to have that growth, then it allows developers to start pitting the two against each other. Right? Well, the county will let me do it this way, well, but the city's going to make me do it that way. And it becomes a game of who can do it for in the easiest and cheapest way. And then you start to see that checkerboard growth pattern, because counties don't have to live with the annexation rules, with the contiguity. Now there still has to be some orderliness to it, just out of practicality. If they have utilities to offer, they can't just extend them anywhere. But we have seen that we have been pitted against the county, and the county's been pitted against us, where you don't have that unified philosophy of how growth ought to happen and where it ought to happen. So it is really important that you're at least having those conversations and agreeing as much as you can. It's probably never going to go perfectly, but it's important to give it a shot.
Thank you both.
All right, before I go in to my question, anybody else want to jump in? Feel free to type in the chat, raise your hand like Deanna did, or just start talking. And elsewise, I'm going to ask mine. I think I may not have this exactly right, but I'm just curious. Can you, because it's a term that I've heard before, and so there may be some people who are tuning in tonight that that have heard this term as well. Can you tell me how, and I think this is going to go to you, Michael, what's the difference between area of impact and urban growth boundary?
Well, in Idaho, a whole lot, because Idaho doesn't allow urban growth boundaries. So area city impact is more the area that is, intended to be annexed into the future at some point in time. Urban growth boundary you see in other Western states, Washington, Oregon. I think there's legislation enabling those, but pretty much it sets a boundary that it's more infill development. You can't grow out beyond that boundary, is my understanding, without amending it.
Okay, and then sort of related to that, your example, Michael, of the two different maps, I think it was like 93 was like bigger, and then it went down in 2004. And so I was kind of curious, is there a guide? Like, does it have to be within a certain period of time? So like you said, I think I heard you say 10 to 20 years. So is there like a reason why, in 93 they thought so big, and then in 2004 they shrunk down their vision of growth? That was a lot of questions in one, so hopefully you kind of know where I'm going.
Yeah, and I don't necessarily know the history of that. I mean, you end up with these conflicts between the people that live in the county, and you already have the conflicts where somebody's in the county, but they're in the area city impact. They don't want the city telling them what to do, right? So you start to get out maybe a mile outside of the city limits, and all of a sudden they have to abide by city's regulations that have been adopted in that area. And you start to run into more and more conflict with the county and the county's residents, out in that area. But and I don't know the original reasoning behind the boundary that happened in 93, but I think that kind of those factors played into that, as well as probably a leadership change at the time, and looking at our annual growth rate, and this where we're growing in certain areas, and just determining that it wasn't feasible to have an area city impact that large and to scale that back down. I mean, it hasn't really changed a whole lot actually since. We've had some minor adjustments, but even since 2005, it hasn't changed substantially, just because we're relatively low growth rate. So.
I see Jan typed a question in the chat. Jan, do you want to unmute and ask your question, or do you want me to ask it for you? My phone's beeping, sorry. Okay, she's still on mute. So her question was, does a parcel ever leave the city?
So I can take that one. It's a really good question. A property owner can request to de-annex and become, going back to being part of the county. I've not dealt with that before. I know that it's a possibility. We've had people ask us how to do it, but the city's starting, really is going to have to ask those questions in reverse. Do we want to stop serving this property? And a property owner needs to ask if they want to be without those services. Do we want our water cut off or our sewer cut off or go back to the police or the sheriff instead of the police? So I think it would have to be a really interesting situation where maybe the city decided, gosh, our growth really got out of hand. We can't afford to do this anymore. Nationally, City of Detroit might be one where you could look at where they've talked about de-annexing. I think they have de-annexed a fair amount of their land because it just got too big to manage. So a property can be de-annexed. I think it's pretty rare in Idaho, but it can happen.
Yeah, we've actually had this question over the last year. We had a property that back in 2014 ended up going through the platting process, but never ended up moving forward from that point. And the property owner was looking at potentially, donating that land to the trust, like a Palouse Land Trust type agency, and was just inquiring about de-annexing the property, probably for tax reasons, up to the point where they donate that to some type of land trust. But we did get that question last year.